So my name is Sandy Millen and I am a freelance ELT consultant, teacher trainer, some materials writing, editor, lots of different things really. The idea of having a materials checklist, partly it came from an MA assignment that I was doing where we had to analyse some materials, but when I was doing it I thought about how useful it would have been when I was a director of studies in the past and I was choosing coursebooks to use in our centre, not having had any training for how to choose coursebooks. And so when I wrote the checklist, I started off with a list of what I thought would be useful for materials within the context I was working in, and then I turned those into a set of criteria with scoring, which I then used to analyse a unit of materials from a book that I was thinking about using or thinking about adapting. The process of writing that checklist made me look at examples of other materials checklists. It made me think about what makes good materials for a particular context. So how do you know that the language work is useful? How do you know that it's helping learners to become more autonomous? Does it support the teachers from that context? Is the page suitable for my learners who have dyslexia, for example? So by going through that whole process, I think it will make me a better materials writer in the future as well. I've only just submitted that checklist for the assignments, but it will help me to become a better materials writer for the future because I had to think so deeply about what to include in the checklist and what not to include, and to do background research based on other examples of checklists.
What's the benefit of collaborating with teachers around selecting materials?
Yeah, so when I was writing my checklist, although it was for an MA assignment and I wasn't working at the school at that point, I went back to a teacher who'd worked with those books and who was in the situation of the teachers, as a new teacher, because I've got a lot of experience now. I can't remember exactly what it's like to be a new teacher. So I asked her to look at my criteria and we compared, would she include the same criteria, and then after that, would she weight them in the same way? My criteria were weighted from 1 to 3. And there were some things where she weighted them lower because as a new teacher, they were less important to her than I might have done. But there were ones that she thought were much more important in the materials that I was like, oh, this is a throwaway point, it's not so important. So that collaborative process just with one other teacher made a real difference to what the final checklist looked like. But you could do that as a group. You could come up with the initial checklist as a group as well. Like, you don't have to make it by yourself. The other points at which you can collaborate when you're actually using the checklist, you can collaborate. You can work with a group of people to and compare your notes. Have you got the same comments? Have you got the same kind of scoring? You can also collaborate afterwards and reflect on whether the checklist actually did the job that you wanted it to do. Whether it's for materials writing or whether it's for choosing materials like within your school.
Okay. And so within the checklist, you talked about it, but it's things like, I know, yeah.
Yeah, so some of the examples of categories that I had were, I had categories related to the learner. So, for example, to what extent do the materials help the learners to become autonomous? I had categories related to skills work. So, to what extent do the listening exercises train learners' listening rather than just testing it? I had things connected to the grammar that was based on the CEFR level that I was working on. And then I had things that were connected to design. So, for example, to what extent do the images display stereotypes of particular cultures or particular genders, for example. And then I had ones that were connected to the planning. So a simple thing, to what extent can a double page spread be used for a 90-minute lesson, which was important in the context that I was working in. So I had categories with criteria within them, and there were around about 25 criteria in the end.
The framing principles and the 10 principles. Can you sort of talk a little bit about those?
So I got the idea of framing principles from watching Jill Hadfield at TEFL Manchester in 2015, and she came up with principles. The set of principles that she was talking about were based on writing a journal while she was doing a materials writing project, and looking back afterwards and thinking about what were the key themes within her journal. What things was she constantly referring to connected to her materials? And these gave her then a set of principles that she could then apply to future future materials. For example, she noticed that she was always putting interaction front and centre within the materials. So I was inspired by that to then come up with, I started with a list of beliefs, but I think that I've turned them into principles. I don't know the technical difference between them, but I started with, this is what I believe makes good materials. So I believe that, for example, that materials, that learners should see themselves in the materials. Or I believe that language shouldn't just be about grammar, it should be about working with Lexis and working with lexical chunks. So I started with those beliefs, and then I can use those when I'm doing materials writing and think. When I'm writing my materials, am I actually following my principles? Or even before I start a project, will this project make me have to ditch some of my principles? Or have I not considered principles connected to these areas, for example? Or after I've finished writing some materials, I can use my list of principles and think about, have I actually met those within my materials? Use it as a kind of checklist, a proofreading checklist, or a reflection checklist of how might I approach my materials in the future based on this set of principles that I've come up with. The checklist that I was writing, I was only analysing the visual part of the materials, but if I was doing it for my own, if I was producing my own kind of coursebook type materials, certainly one of the things I would have is that learners should be exposed to a range of different voices, a range of different accents, and that the pronunciation work that they work on should be geared towards both listening and speaking, so intelligibility with speaking and understanding a range of different people when they're listening. So that principle wasn't on there in my list of beliefs because it wasn't applicable to that context, to the way that I was working with those materials. But I think that's another important thing about having a list of principles, is that they evolve over time, and that you can have a broad list of principles, but maybe only some of them apply to any particular project.
Okay. Do you think, again, there were a few times we talked about inclusivity in the materials. Is that something that you think has sort of become more a focus and more important? It sort of feels like it's become a lot more prominent, and the idea of making sure that, like as you say, that the images don't just feature kind of white men, or the conversation. It's interesting, the conversations, are they initiated by a man and things like that? All of those kind of elements of inclusivity and diversity and things like that. Is that something that has? Do you kind of feel that's become far more?
Definitely. I think if you I've been coming to IATEFL since 2012. If you look at the list of talks in the programme each year, it's quite noticeable that over time, so for example this year there were a few talks about queering pedagogy or queering course books. There was a talk yesterday about how women are represented in course books then and now, and that's where I thought about I'd never considered before, like, is the conversation initiated by a man? And actually most male-female conversations in course books even now are initiated by the man, and that had never occurred to me. And so that those kind of little things that we don't think about, but they're all sending subtle messages. Women can't start conversations, or if you're a man you must be able to start conversations, because it's from both sides. It's the message we're sending to anybody, it's definitely something that people are more aware of, but it's taking a long time to filter through. But it's the same with anything. When I first came to IATEFL, there was very little about listening, pronunciation for listening, for example. John Field's book came out in 2008. Course books are now filtering through, where if you publish a major course book now, it will have pronunciation for listening in it. But it's 2022, it's taken 14 years for that to come through. So those changes happen, but writing a course book series, for example, is a long process, and there's a lot of things to think about. So it's knowing that these changes are coming, but we need to train materials writers to think about those things. We need to train editors to look at them, and we need to train teachers to think about it. We need to train directors of studies to, when they're choosing their course book, or the head teacher or whoever it is who's responsible for choosing the materials, we need to train them to look for those things. So it's got to be across all the levels of the profession.
Yeah. I think sort of look at inclusivity in terms. You were sort of talking about there the sort of issues of gender, but then it was interesting that you touching on sort of layout, and so for dyslexic students, dyspraxic, or and the contrast on the page and things like that.
It's something that John Hurd, I went to some talks that John Hurd did, and he was talking about how he'd worked with, I think it was OUP, to produce some different versions of some of the materials, so that a grammar book that he'd published, they basically produced a second version of it afterwards that was more accessible. But now they're trying, like right from the beginning, the first time that you produce a book, to make the layout accessible, to make it easier to follow, to make it less busy. So for example, like I know from using coursebooks in the past myself, you would very often have a very busy picture with a text on top of it that I found hard to read, and I am a fluent, confident reader. And my poor students who, the letters are jumping around on the page, it's really busy, they can't focus on it. Those kind of things have disappeared, I think, as people have become more aware of it. But that awareness needs to be raised. And again, over time, those changes will be made, that the general way that we think about coursebook design will be less busy. It will be easier for learners to follow. But again, we need to train designers, we need to train the writers, we need to think about the amount of content that we put onto a page, we need to train teachers so that when they look at a page and go, there's not very much on here, they know how to use it.
Okay. Brilliant.
Thanks.